Cold-blooded murder. Detective James was sitting in his cozy apartment, savoring a quiet evening meal. The clinking of utensils and the soft hum of a jazz tune from the nearby radio filled the air. He had barely taken a bite of his freshly buttered bread when the shrill ringtone of his mobile phone shattered the calm ambience. James frowned, his fork pausing midair. Who could it be at this hour? With a resigned sigh, he placed his bread back on the plate, wiped his hands on the napkin, and picked up the phone. The screen displayed a familiar name, Inspector William. "Good evening, Inspector," James greeted, his tone polite but carrying a hint of curiosity. "What brings you to interrupt my dinner?" "Apologies for disturbing you, Detective," William's voice came through, slightly hurried and tinged with unease. "But we've got a situation on our hands. Robert Adams has been found dead in his home, and it's unusual." James straightened in his chair, his detective instincts immediately kicking in. "Unusual how?" "It looks like a suicide," William explained, his voice dropping to a near whisper as though the gravity of the situation demanded it. "The room was locked from the inside. But there's something that doesn't sit right. I need your expertise on this one." James rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He knew William well enough to understand that the seasoned inspector wouldn't call him unless the case was genuinely perplexing. "All right, give me the details," he said, pushing his plate aside. "Adams was found in his study," William continued, his tone becoming more urgent. "The door was locked from the inside, and the key was in his pocket. A revolver was in his hand, and there's a gunshot wound to his chest. There's a fair bit of blood, and, well, something feels off." James let out a low whistle, his mind already racing. "Locked room, gunshot, and no obvious way for anyone to enter or exit," he muttered. "That is a puzzle. Who found him?" "His maid, Sarah," William replied. "She called his wife, Mrs. Adams, who was out at a kiddie party. The son, Martin, claims he was in his room playing games. I'll fill you in on the rest when you get here." James stood, grabbing his coat and scarf. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said briskly. "Text me the address." As he ended the call, the detective couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement mixed with dread. Cases like this were rare, and while he relished the challenge, he knew such situations often concealed more than they revealed. It was a crisp evening as James stepped out into the city streets. The yellow glow of the streetlights reflected off the slick pavement, and the faint buzz of distant traffic filled the air. He flagged down a cab and gave the address to the driver, leaning back into the worn leather seat as he mentally prepared for the scene he was about to encounter. The Adams residence was a sprawling suburban home, its pristine facade now shadowed by the grim reality inside. Police cars lined the driveway, their flashing lights casting eerie red and blue patterns on the walls. James stepped out of the cab, his sharp eyes taking in every detail as he approached the entrance. Inspector William met him at the door, his brow furrowed. "James, glad you're here," he said, his voice steady but low. "This one's a real head-scratcher." "Show me," James replied, his voice calm but firm. William led him through the immaculate hallway, past concerned officers and murmuring neighbors peeking through the curtains. They entered the study, and the scene before James was both chilling and intriguing. Robert Adams lay sprawled on the floor, a pool of blood around him staining the polished wooden floorboards. The revolver was still clutched in his right hand, and his face was frozen in a grimace of pain. The room was orderly, almost unnervingly so, with a large desk, a bookshelf, and a leather chair that seemed untouched. James knelt by the body, his sharp eyes scanning every inch. "No signs of a struggle," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "The door was locked from the inside, you said?" William nodded. "The only way in or out?" "And the key?" "Was in his pocket," James finished, standing and brushing off his knees. "Classic locked room scenario. But something doesn't fit." He walked to the door, inspecting the lock closely. Then his gaze moved to the window. It was latched securely, with no signs of tampering. James's mind was already piecing together possibilities, discarding the implausible as he went. "The shot came from close range?" he asked, turning back to William. "That's what it looks like," William replied, gesturing toward the revolver. "No exit wound, and there's powder residue around the chest wound." James crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "And yet," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "if he had shot himself, there should be residue on his hand as well." William blinked, his lips parting in realization. "But there isn't." "Exactly," James said, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "Which means this wasn't a suicide. It was a murder. And someone wanted us to believe otherwise." The room fell silent as James's declaration hung in the air. William's jaw tightened as he glanced back at the body. "But how?" he asked. "How could the killer leave the room locked from the inside?" James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched again, his fingers delicately lifting the edge of Robert's coat to reveal a slight drag mark in the blood pool. He glanced up at William, his sharp eyes glinting. "That," he said, standing with quiet determination, "is the question we're going to answer." James straightened his coat and adjusted his scarf, already envisioning the web of lies and clues he was about to untangle. The mystery had begun, and he was ready to uncover the truth. The study was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of a desk lamp casting a pale glow over the room. Detective James stepped through the doorway, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the scene. The air was heavy, tinged with the metallic scent of blood. Robert Adams lay lifeless on the polished wooden floor, a crimson pool spreading beneath him. His right hand loosely clutched a revolver, and his expression was frozen in a mix of pain and shock. The door clicked shut behind James, and Inspector William, standing nearby, broke the silence. "Locked room, 1 bullet to the chest, revolver in hand," William said, his voice low, as if not to disturb the dead. "It's got all the hallmarks of suicide." James didn't respond immediately. He knelt down next to the body, careful not to disturb the scene. The soft creak of the floorboards under his weight was the only sound. His gaze flicked over every detail, the position of the body, the angle of the gun, the blood splatter pattern. His gloved fingers hovered near Robert's hand, noting the loose grip on the weapon. "If it's suicide," James finally said, his voice calm and measured, "it's a rather dramatic one." He gestured to the revolver. "A shot to the chest isn't exactly a common choice." William sighed, stepping closer. His boots echoed softly as he moved. "He's been under a lot of stress," the inspector said, crossing his arms. The man's business was failing. Lost a fortune in the last quarter. Everyone knew he was at the end of his rope. James looked up at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Desperation doesn't always lead to suicide, Inspector. And even if it did, there are some things here that don't add up." William tilted his head, intrigued. "Such as?" "For starters," James said, standing up and pointing at the blood pool, "the body's position suggests he was dragged slightly after he fell. Look closely, there's a faint smear in the blood." William leaned in, squinting. "I see it now," he muttered. "But why would someone drag the body if he killed himself?" "Exactly," James replied, stepping toward the desk. His eyes swept over its surface, neatly arranged papers, an untouched glass of water, and a single key resting on the polished wood. This was deliberate, calculated. The killer wanted it to look like suicide, but details always betray intent. William frowned, glancing back at the body. "The door was locked from the inside, James," he argued. "And the key was in his pocket when we found him. How do you explain that?" James picked up the key from the desk, holding it up to the light. "This key didn't lock the door," he said confidently. "The real key is still in his pocket, isn't it?" William nodded. "Yeah. I checked it myself." James set the key back down, his expression thoughtful. Then whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They likely used some kind of mechanism to lock the door after they left. A string, maybe. Something clever, but not clever enough. William stared at James, his skepticism fading into reluctant admiration. All right, say it wasn't suicide. Who would want him dead? James walked to the window, peering out at the quiet suburban street bathed in moonlight. That's the question, isn't it? But tell me this, who found the body? The maid, Sarah, William answered, rubbing the back of his neck. She said she knocked on the door around 7 to bring him coffee. When he didn't answer, she called Mrs. Adams, who was out at some party. The son, Martin, was upstairs. At least, that's their story. James turned to face William, his expression unreadable. And Mrs. Adams? What's her take on all this? She's shaken, William said with a shrug. Claims she didn't know anything was wrong. Says Robert had been distant lately but never showed any signs he'd do something like this. James walked back to the body, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Distant, he murmured, kneeling down again. People can hide a lot, but this doesn't feel like a man distancing himself. This feels like someone trying to erase something. William watched him closely. Erase what? James looked up, his eyes sharp and focused. The truth, he said simply. This wasn't just about business. There's more to this, and I intend to find out what. He stood, brushing off his coat. We'll need to question everyone again. The maid, the son, the wife. Neighbors, too. Someone knows something, even if they don't realize it yet. William nodded, already pulling out his notepad. You think one of them did it? James didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the door, examining the lock mechanism. His fingers traced the edges as he frowned in concentration. I think, he said slowly, that we're dealing with someone who's very good at covering their tracks. But nobody's perfect. He glanced back at the inspector, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. And if there's a crack in this story, I'll find it. The room fell silent once more, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. William watched as James moved about the room with a quiet intensity, his mind clearly working at a pace too quick for words. For James, the locked room wasn't just a crime scene, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved, and every detail, no matter how small, was a piece of the truth waiting to be uncovered. Detective James crouched by the body of Robert Adams, his sharp gaze sweeping over the lifeless form sprawled on the floor. The metallic tang of blood hung heavily in the air, mingling with the faint scent of leather from the revolver still loosely clasped in Robert's right hand. The scene was meticulously staged, almost too perfect. James had seen enough crime scenes to recognize when something didn't sit right. Something's off here, William, James muttered, breaking the thick silence in the room. Inspector William, who was standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, looked skeptical. Off? It seems pretty straightforward, James. Locked room, revolver in hand, and a man with too many financial woes. Looks like suicide to me. James tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as they lingered on Robert's chest wound. Blood had soaked through the crisp white fabric of the man's shirt, creating a macabre centerpiece that drew attention to the bullet hole directly over his heart. James spoke softly, almost to himself. If this was a suicide, he began, why aim for the chest? Why not the head? A shot to the chest isn't immediate, it's painful, drawn out. He gestured to the gun in Robert's hand. And from the angle of the wound, the shot came from several feet away. Do you really think he held the gun at arm's length to shoot himself? William stepped closer, peering at the body as if seeing it for the first time. Several feet? How can you tell? James pointed to the faint stippling around the bullet hole, or, rather, the lack of it. When a gun is fired at close range, there's usually gunpowder stippling or burns on the skin. Here, there's nothing. The shot was fired from a distance of at least 6 or 7 feet. That's no suicide. William frowned, his brow furrowing as he processed James's words. All right, say you're right and it's not suicide. How do you explain the locked door? The key was found in his pocket, James. Who else could have locked it? James stood and crossed his arms, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's focus. His gaze settled on the body once more, and he noticed something that made him crouch again. Drag marks, he said suddenly. Drag marks? William echoed, stepping closer. James pointed to the faint smudges in the blood surrounding Robert's body. Look here, near his left arm. See how the blood pattern isn't consistent? Someone dragged the body, just slightly, but enough to leave a trace. William knelt beside James, squinting at the marks. Why would someone drag the body? To stage the scene, James replied matter-of-factly. The killer wanted it to look like suicide. That's why the gun's in his hand and the door's locked. But the details betray them. Look at how the gun is positioned, it's too loose in his grip. If he'd shot himself, his hand would still be gripping it tightly, at least for a few moments after death. This is staged. William stood, scratching his head. All right, let's say it's murder. How did they lock the door from the inside and still get out? There's no sign of forced entry or exit. James walked over to the desk, where a single brass key sat in plain sight. He picked it up and held it up to the light. This is the spare, isn't it? He asked. William nodded. Yes, but the main key was in his pocket. I checked myself. James turned the key over in his gloved hand, his mind working through the possibilities. The killer likely used some sort of mechanism to lock the door after they left. A string or wire, perhaps, attached to the key. Once the door was locked, they pulled the string free, leaving no trace of tampering. It's clever, but not foolproof. William sighed, his expression shifting from skepticism to reluctant acceptance. You've got a point. But who would go to such lengths? And why? James set the key back on the desk and moved toward Robert's body again. His gloved fingers reached into the deceased man's coat pocket, retrieving the key found earlier. Holding it up, he examined it closely, noting a faint, almost imperceptible smear of red near the top. The killer placed the key in his pocket after locking the door, James concluded. It's another attempt to mislead us into thinking Robert locked the door himself before pulling the trigger. But they got sloppy. There's blood on this key, likely transferred from the killer's hands when they staged the scene. William leaned against the desk, exhaling heavily. So, we're looking for someone who knew him well enough to stage all this. Someone who'd know about his financial troubles and use them as a motive for the fake suicide. James nodded, his gaze distant as his mind pieced the puzzle together. The motive may go deeper than money, William. This kind of meticulous planning speaks to personal stakes, something beyond mere revenge or desperation. We'll need to question everyone who was in or around the house at the time of the murder. William flipped open his notepad, scribbling furiously. The maid found the body, the wife was at a party, and the son was upstairs. That's the main timeline we're working with. Where do we start? James straightened, his eyes blazing with determination. With the maid, Seema. She's the one who discovered the body and raised the alarm. We'll see if her story holds up under scrutiny. After that, we'll dig into the wife's alibi and the son's activities. No stone unturned, William. The inspector nodded, slipping his notepad back into his pocket. All right, James. Let's get to work. As they exited the room, the weight of the mystery hung in the air like a dense fog. For James, the challenge wasn't just uncovering the truth, it was unmasking a murderer who had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury it. James adjusted the cuffs of his coat as he stood in the lavishly decorated living room of the Adams residence, the opulence starkly at odds with the grim events of the evening. Across from him, perched on the edge of a cream-colored couch, was Mrs. Evelyn Adams, her face pale and her hands clutching a handkerchief as though it were her lifeline. The room was eerily quiet except for the faint ticking of a nearby grandfather clock. "Mrs. Adams," James began, his voice calm yet probing, "I understand this is a difficult time, but I need you to recount your whereabouts earlier this evening. Every detail matters." Evelyn dabbed at her eyes and nodded. "I was at a kiddie party," she said, her voice trembling. "It was at my friend Gita's house. I left here around 6:30 p.m., stayed for a couple of hours, and then came back when Sarah, our maid, called me." She sniffled and looked up at James with pleading eyes. "I had no idea something so horrible would happen." James tilted his head, studying her carefully. "What time did you receive Sarah's call?" "Close to 8:15, Evelyn replied. "She told me Robert wasn't answering the door, and she was worried. I came back immediately. When I got home, the door to his room was still locked. We had to unlock it with his spare key, and then I saw him." Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. James let her collect herself before continuing. "And at the party, were you there the entire time? Did you step out for any reason?" Evelyn frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. "I might have stepped out briefly. Oh yes, I left for about 15 minutes to grab my purse. I'd forgotten it at home. But I went straight back to the party after getting it." James exchanged a quick glance with Inspector William, who stood quietly by the doorway. "And during that brief time, did anyone see you, either here or on your way back to the party?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "The streets were quiet, and I was in and out quickly." "Thank you, Mrs. Adams," James said. "For now, that will be all. Please stay here, we may need to ask more questions." As Evelyn nodded, her eyes clouded with grief, James turned his attention to Sarah, the maid. She stood near the dining table, her hands nervously fidgeting with the edge of her apron. Her posture was stiff, and she avoided James's penetrating gaze. "Sarah," he began, his tone firm but not unkind, "I need you to tell me everything that happened this evening, starting from the moment you noticed something unusual." Sarah swallowed hard and nodded. I went to Mr. Adams's room at 8 p.m. to bring him his coffee, like I always do. I knocked several times, but he didn't answer. I thought maybe he was asleep or didn't hear me, but after a few minutes, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't like him not to respond." James leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "What did you do next?" "I went to his son, Martin," Sarah continued. "I told him Mr. Adams wasn't answering the door. Martin seemed distracted, he was playing games on his phone. He told me not to worry, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I called Mrs. Adams." James nodded, jotting down notes in his small leather notebook. "When you knocked on the door, did you hear anything? Movement, voices, anything unusual?" Sarah shook her head vehemently. "No, sir. It was completely silent." "And you didn't try to open the door yourself?" "No, sir," she said quickly. "The door was locked, and I didn't have a key. Only Mr. Adams had the main key, and Mrs. Adams kept the spare." James paused, considering her words. "Sarah, did you notice anyone else in or around the house during that time? Any visitors or anything out of place?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "No, I didn't see anyone. But I thought I heard something earlier in the evening. Maybe around 7:30. It was faint, like a thud, but I didn't think much of it at the time." James exchanged another glance with William. "A thud," he repeated. "You didn't investigate?" "No, sir," Sarah admitted, wringing her hands. "I was in the kitchen, and I thought maybe it was just Mr. Adams moving something in his room." James's mind raced as he pieced the timeline together. The thud at 7:30 could align with the time of death. "One last question," Sarah. How long have you worked for the Addams family? About 5 years, she replied. They've always been good to me. I can't imagine why anyone would want to hurt Mr. Addams. James studied her for a moment longer before nodding. Thank you, Sarah. Please stay here for now. As he stepped away, William approached, his voice low. What do you think? James glanced back at the two women, both engulfed in their respective grief and anxiety. Evelyn's story aligns for now, but that 15-minute window when she left the party needs verification. As for Sarah, she seems genuinely shaken, but I'm not ruling anyone out yet. William sighed. And the son? Martin? We'll talk to him next, James said. But for now, I'm focusing on the timeline. The thud Sarah heard could be crucial. It matches the likely time of death. Anything else? William asked. James nodded, his gaze sharpening. Yes. The locked door. The killer staged this, William. It's too neat, too calculated. Someone in this house knows more than they're letting on. The Addams household was silent except for the occasional murmur of voices as James and Inspector William moved through the corridors, piecing together the narrative. The next stop was Martin, Robert's teenage son, whose room was dimly lit, cluttered with posters of video game characters, and the faint glow of a gaming console in the corner. Martin sat on his bed, fidgeting with the hem of his sweatshirt. His eyes darted nervously between James and William as they entered. James noticed the young man's knee bouncing anxiously and the way his hands clenched and unclenched. He took a moment to scan the room, the piles of clothes, the empty soda cans, and the gaming setup before speaking. Martin, James began, his voice steady and reassuring, I know this is difficult, but I need to know where you were earlier this evening. Martin swallowed hard and looked at the floor. I was here. In my room. James raised an eyebrow. And what were you doing? Playing games, Martin said quickly. With my friends. We were online together the whole time. James stepped closer, pulling out his notebook. Online with friends, you say? What time did you start playing? Martin hesitated, his fingers fumbling with his phone. I think around 6. Yeah, 6. We played until about 8:30. James nodded, noting the time. And during this time, did you hear or notice anything unusual? Any sounds, knocks on the door? No, Martin said, his voice almost defensive. I had my headphones on the whole time. I didn't hear anything. William leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. Sarah said she told you your father wasn't answering his door. Martin stiffened. She did. I told her not to worry. Dad usually liked to be left alone when he was in his room. Did it not strike you as odd that he wasn't responding? James asked, his gaze piercing. Martin shrugged, though the movement seemed forced. I thought he was just busy. Maybe on a call or something. I didn't think anything was wrong. James tilted his head, scrutinizing the boy's demeanor. Martin, I'm going to need the usernames of the friends you were playing with. I'll have to confirm your story. Martin's eyes widened, and his hands gripped his phone tighter. Why? I told you the truth. Ask them if you want, but I didn't do anything. James remained calm. This is standard procedure, Martin. It's not about accusing you, it's about eliminating possibilities. Do you understand? After a long pause, Martin nodded and mumbled the usernames of his friends. James wrote them down and gave the boy a small nod before leaving the room with William. Once they were back in the main hallway, William glanced at James. What do you think? Is he hiding something? He's scared, James replied, his tone thoughtful. But scared doesn't always mean guilty. We'll confirm his alibi and go from there. For now, let's check on Mrs. Addams' alibi. The two made their way to Mina Benson's house, where the kiddie party had been held earlier in the evening. Mina, a cheerful woman in her late 40s with a warm smile, welcomed them into her tastefully decorated home. The faint scent of lavender filled the air, and the remnants of the evening's party were evident: empty wine glasses and scattered cushions. "Detective," Mina said brightly, gesturing to the living room, "how can I help?" James wasted no time. "Mrs. Adams mentioned she was at your kiddie party tonight. We're here to confirm her alibi." "Oh, of course," Mina said with a nod. "Evelyn was here. She arrived around 6:30 and stayed until about 8:15, I believe." "Did she stay the entire time?" William interjected, his eyes narrowing slightly. Mina hesitated, a faint crease forming on her forehead. "Well, almost the entire time. She left for about 15 minutes, maybe closer to 20. She said she'd forgotten her purse and needed to fetch it." James leaned forward slightly, his tone soft but probing. "What time did she leave, and what time did she return?" "She left around 7:30, Mina said, thinking back. "She came back before 8. I remember because we just finished a round of cards, and she joined us for the next game." "And was there anything unusual about her behavior when she returned?" James asked. Mina frowned thoughtfully. "Not particularly. She seemed a little flustered, but I assumed it was because she was in a hurry. She didn't say much about it." James exchanged a quick glance with William. "Did anyone notice her leaving or returning?" "Oh, I'm sure some of the ladies did," Mina replied. "We were all in the living room, so she passed by us on her way out and back in." James nodded and straightened. "Thank you, Mrs. Benson. Your help is invaluable." As they left the house, William turned to James. 15 minutes. That's just enough time to leave, commit the act, and return." "It's possible," James admitted. "But we'll need to corroborate her timeline further. Right now, we have too many loose threads. Martin's alibi needs confirmation, and Evelyn's brief absence needs scrutiny. And then there's Sarah's account." William sighed, shaking his head. "This case is a labyrinth." James smiled faintly. "A labyrinth always has a path out, Inspector. We just need to find it." The night was cool and quiet as James and William returned to the Adams residence. The puzzle was beginning to take shape, but key pieces were still missing. James had a hunch forming, but hunches alone wouldn't crack this case. Evidence and corroboration were what he needed. Once inside, James turned to William. "Inspector, I want you to gather everyone, Mrs. Adams, Sarah, and Martin. We need them all in one place soon." William nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'll handle it. What about Martin's friends? Are you still planning to verify his story?" James nodded. "Yes, I'll need the phone numbers of the friends he claims to have been playing with. If his alibi checks out, we can eliminate him from suspicion and focus on the remaining players." William stepped out to make the calls while James settled into a quiet corner of the living room, pulling out his own phone. He quickly navigated to the numbers Martin had provided, jotting down notes as he prepared to make his inquiries. The first call went smoothly. A boy named Kevin answered, sounding drowsy but cooperative. "Yes, we were playing PUBG," Kevin confirmed. "It was me, Martin, and a couple of other guys. We started around 6 and kept going until a little after 8. Did Martin step away at any point?" James asked, his voice calm but probing. "No, not that I remember," Kevin said. "We were all on voice chat the whole time. If he had left, we'd have noticed." James thanked him and moved on to the next call. The responses from the other two friends, Ethan and Sam, matched Kevin's account almost word for word. Martin had been online, chatting and playing with them continuously for the entire timeframe in question. James scratched his chin thoughtfully as he ended the final call. Martin's alibi was solid, eliminating him from the suspect pool. William re-entered the room, tucking his phone back into his pocket. Everyone's gathered. What did you find out about Martin? His story checks out, James replied. He was playing PUBG with his friends during the time of the murder. They were in constant communication on voice chat. That removes him from suspicion. William exhaled, clearly relieved to narrow the field. That leaves Sarah and Mrs. Adams. James stood, his eyes narrowing. Exactly. Both have cracks in their stories. Sarah claims she knocked on the door at 8 and got no response, but something feels off about her behavior. As for Mrs. Adams, she conveniently left the kiddie party for a short window of time, long enough to commit the act. We need to dig deeper into both of their motives and actions. They made their way to the dining room, where Mrs. Adams, Sarah, and Martin were seated. The tension in the air was palpable. Martin looked confused but calmer now that his name had been cleared, while Mrs. Adams sat with her hands clasped tightly on the table. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed restless, her eyes darting around the room. James addressed the group, his voice steady but commanding. I've verified Martin's alibi. He was indeed with his friends, playing games during the time of the murder. That narrows down our focus. Mrs. Adams raised her chin, her voice icy. And you think it's me? How absurd. I told you, I was at Mina's party. You left the party for nearly 20 minutes, James countered. That's enough time to slip back home and return without anyone being the wiser. Her composure faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained it. I forgot my purse. That's all. James didn't respond directly but turned his attention to Sarah. And you, Sarah. You claim you knocked on the door at 8 to deliver coffee and found no response. Yet, you didn't seem particularly alarmed. Sarah fidgeted, avoiding his gaze. Mr. Adams often didn't answer immediately. I thought he was busy. You thought he was busy? James repeated, his tone skeptical. Busy doing what? He was locked in his room for hours before that. What exactly did you think he was doing? Sarah hesitated, and her voice wavered. I didn't know. I was just following my routine. James took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And yet, something about your routine feels rehearsed, Sarah. As if you've been preparing for these questions. William stepped forward, his patience thinning. Enough dancing around. If either of you knows anything, now's the time to speak. The room fell into a heavy silence. James let the quiet linger, watching their reactions. Mrs. Adams remained stoic, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Sarah's unease grew visibly. James finally broke the silence. Let me spell this out, he said, his tone firm. The murder of Robert Adams was carefully planned. The locked room, the staged suicide, it wasn't spontaneous. It was executed by someone with access to his routine and his surroundings. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the evidence. Sarah's breathing quickened, and she looked away. James didn't press further, not yet. He needed more than just body language, he needed a confession or concrete proof. For now, he had established the framework. The next step would be extracting the truth. The following day, as the morning sun painted the streets in a soft golden glow, James drove to Sarah's modest residence. The suspicion surrounding her behavior gnawed at his thoughts. Her evasive answers and nervous demeanor were out of place. If she had nothing to hide, why did she act like a cornered prey? Pulling up in front of her house, James stepped out of his car and surveyed the small, well-kept home. Curtains were drawn, and the house gave off an air of emptiness. He approached the front door and knocked firmly. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. James glanced around the quiet neighborhood before pulling a small toolkit from his pocket. With practiced precision, he worked the lock. A soft click announced his success, and he slipped inside, careful not to disturb anything. The air inside was heavy with the faint smell of cleaning products. The living room was tidy, almost obsessively so, with every piece of furniture and decoration in perfect alignment. It felt staged, as if designed to keep prying eyes away from hidden secrets. James began his search systematically, starting in the living room and moving to the kitchen. Drawers were opened and closed, their contents noted but not unusual. It wasn't until he reached Sarah's bedroom that his instincts sharpened. The bed was neatly made, but the closet door was slightly ajar. James approached it cautiously and pulled the door open. Inside, hanging among an array of simple clothing, was a fishing rod. Its presence struck James immediately. He lifted it carefully, inspecting the fine wire attached to the rod. It was similar to the wire he had found traces of in Robert's room, the same kind that had been used to manipulate the locked door from the outside. This was it, the missing link. His pulse quickened as he continued to search the room. In a small drawer by the bedside, he found a photograph, yellowed with age. It depicted a younger Robert Adams with a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sarah. James studied the photo, noting the date scrawled in faded ink on the back. The connection was clear now, this wasn't just a murder, it was personal. Satisfied he had gathered enough evidence, James carefully returned the room to its original state and slipped out of the house, locking the door behind him. As he got into his car, his mind raced with the implications of what he had discovered. It was time to confront Sarah and lay the truth bare for all to see. That evening, the Adams residence buzzed with tension. William had gathered all the suspects, Mrs. Adams, Martin, and Sarah, into the spacious living room. The air was thick with unease as they waited for James to arrive. When he walked through the door, his presence commanded immediate attention. He carried a briefcase in one hand, his face calm but determined. "Thank you all for being here," James began, his voice steady. "This won't take long. I believe I've uncovered the truth about Robert's death." Mrs. Adams folded her arms defensively. "If you're here to accuse me again, detective, you're wasting your time. I've told you everything." James smiled faintly but didn't respond to her. He turned his gaze to Sarah, who sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She avoided his eyes, her knuckles white. "I visited your house today, Sarah," James said, his tone deliberate. "It was locked, of course, but that didn't stop me." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "You broke into my house. That's illegal." "What's illegal," James countered sharply, "is murder. And that's what we're here to address. Shall I continue?" The room fell silent. James reached into his briefcase and pulled out the fishing rod, holding it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, "is the tool used to stage the crime scene. The wire attached to this rod matches the marks I found on the key used to lock Robert's door from the inside. It was used to create the illusion of a locked-room suicide." He set the rod down on the coffee table and then pulled out the photograph. Walking over to Sarah, he handed it to her. "This was also in your house. Care to explain?" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she stared at the photo. Her hands trembled, and she clutched it to her chest. James continued. "This photo shows Robert Adams with your mother, doesn't it? He abandoned her, didn't he? Left her to face the world alone, with you as her only family." Sarah broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. The room watched in stunned silence as James pressed on. "You resented him for it. You grew up hearing your mother's pain and society's judgment. When you finally had the chance to get close to him, you saw the opportunity to take revenge." "No," Sarah cried, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. He ruined her life, our lives. He didn't deserve to walk away like nothing happened." James leaned in, his voice soft but firm. "And so you killed him. You shot him, staged the scene with the fishing rod to lock the door, and tried to make it look like suicide. But you made one mistake, you underestimated how closely I would look." Sarah collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands. Mrs. Adams gasped, tears streaming down her face, while Martin sat in stunned silence. William stepped forward, his hand on his holstered weapon. "Sarah Thompson, you're under arrest for the murder of Robert Adams." As William recited her rights, James stepped back, the weight of the case lifting slightly from his shoulders. Justice had been served, and the truth revealed, but the lingering pain in the room was a stark reminder that some wounds could never fully heal. James stood at the center of the room, his calm voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. The suspects sat before him, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and defiance. The fishing rod lay on the coffee table like a silent accuser, its presence heavy with unspoken revelations. "Now, let me explain exactly how Robert's death was staged," James began, his voice firm but deliberate. He turned to the group, his gaze lingering on Sarah for a moment before continuing. "The locked room was the perfect misdirection," he said. "When Inspector William and I arrived, it appeared that Robert had locked himself inside before taking his own life. But the truth is far more insidious." James picked up the fishing rod, holding it up for everyone to see. "This was the tool used to stage the scene. It's an old trick, but an effective one when executed carefully. The murderer tied a thin wire to the key and used this fishing rod to guide it through the keyhole from the outside." He paused, allowing the image to settle in their minds. Once the key was inside, they turned it to lock the door. After locking it, they used the rod to carefully pull the wire back out, leaving no trace, except, of course, the faint drag marks I found on the floor near Robert's body. Mrs. Adams raised a trembling hand to her mouth, her voice barely above a whisper. That's impossible. How could someone do that without being seen?" James nodded, anticipating the question. "It requires precision and a good understanding of the layout of the door. But the real brilliance, or arrogance, depending on how you see it, was in ensuring the key ended up in Robert's pocket." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the small evidence bag containing the broken piece of fishing wire he had found earlier. This fragment was tied to the key when it was manipulated. After locking the door, the murderer slipped it into Robert's pocket using the fishing rod. The piece broke off during the process, leaving behind this critical clue. James turned his attention to Sarah, whose face had grown pale. "I found another spool of this same wire in your house, Sarah. It's an exact match. Do you have an explanation for that?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She seemed to shrink in her chair, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "Let me spell it out for you," James continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You planned this meticulously. You waited for a moment when Robert was alone, knowing you could make it look like a suicide. You brought the fishing rod and wire with you, confident that no one would suspect the maid. After the murder, you staged the locked room, pocketed the evidence, and went about your business as if nothing had happened." The silence in the room was deafening. Martin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his wide eyes fixed on James. Mrs. Adams let out a soft gasp, her hand clutching her chest. "But there was one thing you didn't account for," James said, setting the rod down with a deliberate motion. "The residue from the fishing wire on the floor. It was subtle, but it told a story. And when I found the matching wire at your house, that story became crystal clear." Sarah's lips trembled as she finally spoke, her voice cracking with emotion. I didn't mean to. He deserved it for what he did to my mother. He ruined her life, left us with nothing. She died hating him." Her confession hung in the air, raw and unrestrained. Tears streamed down her face as she buried her head in her hands, her sobs filling the silence. James softened his tone but remained resolute. "I understand your pain, Sarah. But taking a life in revenge doesn't heal the wounds of the past. It only creates more pain, more loss." William stepped forward, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Sarah Thompson, you're under arrest for the murder of Robert Adams." His voice was firm but not unkind as he began reciting her rights. As Sarah was led away, James turned to Mrs. Adams and Martin. "I'm sorry you had to endure this, but the truth needed to come out. Robert's death wasn't the act of desperation it seemed, it was a calculated act of vengeance." Mrs. Adams nodded slowly, her tear-streaked face etched with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Martin sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as if struggling to process the whirlwind of revelations. James stood quietly for a moment, watching the emotions ripple through the room. He had uncovered the truth, but it was a hollow victory. In the end, justice had been served, but the scars left behind would linger long after the case was closed. The room fell into an uneasy silence as James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. The edges were curled, and the black and white image had faded with age, but the faces within it were still clear enough to reveal their significance. He held the photo up for the group to see, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces before he spoke. "This," James began, his voice measured, "was taken many years ago. The man in this photo is Robert Adams, long before he built his wealth. And the woman beside him," he paused, allowing the tension in the room to build. "That is Sarah's mother." The impact of the revelation was immediate. Mrs. Adams gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked from the photograph to Sarah, who sat motionless, her face pale, her eyes averted. Sarah's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. "This is an old photograph, taken in a time when Robert Adams was far from the successful businessman he later became," James continued, his voice low but steady. "But what's most significant about this photograph is what it represents, a past that Robert tried to bury." Sarah finally looked up, her eyes locking with James. The bitterness in them was undeniable. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice tight, barely above a whisper. James set the photograph down gently on the table, the image of Robert and Sarah's mother now visible for all to see. "This photograph shows a man who, in his younger years, had an affair with a woman named Clara Thompson, Sarah's mother. They were involved, and Sarah was born as a result. But Robert never acknowledged her. He abandoned Clara when he found out she was pregnant and never gave her or Sarah a second thought." He paused, letting the words sink in as the room grew heavier with the weight of the truth. Mrs. Adams looked as though she might faint, her face blanching as the revelation unfolded. But it was Sarah who was the focus now. Her eyes filled with something between fury and sadness, the facade she had been trying to maintain cracking under the pressure of the truth. "Sarah," James continued gently, "this photo isn't just about the past. It's about the present. Your entire life, you've lived with the resentment of being abandoned by the man who should have cared for you. And when you learned that Robert was still alive and thriving while your mother had died alone, neglected, something inside you snapped." Sarah's breath hitched, her fists tightening in her lap. She turned her gaze away from James, staring out the window, as if searching for a way to escape the suffocating reality he was forcing her to confront. "Isn't that true?" James asked softly, his voice like a quiet prod. "You hated him for what he did to your mother. And when you saw how easy it was to walk into Robert's life, to take revenge for everything he had done to you both." Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Stop," she yelled, her voice raw with emotion. "I had to do it. He ruined our lives. My mother died because of him. She died knowing she was just another one of his forgotten women. And when I found out that he was still living his luxurious life, still throwing parties, still pretending like nothing ever happened," her voice trembled with anger and grief. "I couldn't take it anymore." James remained calm, but there was a sadness in his eyes as he watched her unravel. "So, you killed him to avenge your mother," he said quietly. "You planned it carefully, didn't you? The locked door. The fishing rod trick. It was all to make it look like a suicide." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, but there was no remorse in her expression, only a deep, seething rage that had been festering for years. She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. Yes. I did it. I shot him. I didn't care anymore. After everything he didn't deserve to live. The confession hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. The room felt colder now, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Mrs. Adams, who had been silent throughout, looked at Sarah with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. You killed him?" she asked, her voice trembling as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Sarah didn't look at her mother, her eyes were fixed on the ground, her hands fidgeting restlessly. "He left us with nothing," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My mother had nothing when she died. No one cared about us. No one. And when I found out he had everything, all his money, his family, while we were just forgotten. I wanted him to feel the pain. I wanted him to know that he couldn't just ignore what he did. He couldn't just pretend it never happened." James' voice broke the silence again, more quietly this time. "You used the fishing rod to lock the door from the outside, to make it look like Robert had done everything himself. You knew that no one would suspect you, that no one would think the maid could be capable of such a thing." Sarah nodded, her hands shaking. "I knew I had to make it look like a suicide, or else they would have found out the truth. I knew I had to cover my tracks, make everything fit, make it believable." She looked up at James, her eyes filled with a strange defiance. "I didn't care anymore. I was done pretending." James took a step back, his eyes never leaving her face. "And now you'll face the consequences for what you've done." Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't beg for mercy. She simply stood there, her heartache too deep for words, and the weight of the truth crashing down upon her. As the officers moved to arrest Sarah, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if time itself had paused in that moment of revelation. The truth had finally come out, but it was a bitter, painful truth. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension as Sarah stood there, her confession still hanging in the air like a dark cloud. She didn't resist when the officers moved toward her, her hands trembling slightly as they placed the handcuffs on her wrists. Her expression was a mixture of resignation and defiance, as though she had been carrying the burden of this moment for far too long. "Sarah Thompson," one of the officers said, his voice firm, "you are under arrest for the murder of Robert Adams. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Sarah didn't respond, her eyes distant, as if the weight of her actions had finally caught up with her. As the officers led her out of the room, James watched in silence. The once chaotic energy of the room had been replaced by an eerie stillness, the finality of the confession settling over them all. Mrs. Adams remained seated, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. She had barely spoken since the truth had come out, her eyes hollow as she stared at the door where her daughter had just been led away. Martin stood by her side, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes on the ground. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, no one knew what to say. Finally, it was Inspector William who broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "It's over. The case is solved. Robert Adams' death wasn't a suicide, it was cold-blooded murder. And now, justice will be served." James turned to Inspector William, who had been taking notes throughout the entire ordeal. "Make sure Sarah's taken to the station and booked properly. I'll handle the paperwork for the post-mortem." He glanced at the team still gathered in the room. "We'll make sure Robert's body is examined thoroughly, and we'll leave no stone unturned." William nodded in agreement. "Understood, James. We'll get it all squared away. The autopsy will confirm what we already know, Sarah shot Robert. The rest is just a matter of formalities now." He walked toward the desk where the photograph of Robert and Sarah's mother still sat. It seemed almost surreal that such a small object could hold so much power. A single image had unraveled years of lies and deceit, had exposed the truth in the most shocking way possible. Inspector William came up beside him. Do you think Sarah would have ever confessed if you hadn't figured it out? He asked, his voice thoughtful. James shook his head slowly. No. She was too deeply hurt by what Robert had done to her mother. She carried that pain for years. But in the end, it was the truth that caught up with her. And the truth always comes out, one way or another.